Hi everyone and welcome to the Merlin's Magic Workshop. My name is Jeremy and I hope you are doing well because today we are going to paint another Space Marine in the style of simplified non-metallic. And this time we will work on a color that many people ask me, I suppose many Black Templar fans, because I'm obviously talking about the black scheme. So to remind you the big picture, we started the painting series with blue and green. These are relatively easy colors to start with, so we could really focus on the painting process to establish the non-metallic effect. Then with the red and yellow schemes, we added a level of difficulty because those paints are usually translucent. So we had to adapt the process to overcome this problem and actually to use it to our advantage. And today with the black scheme and the white that will be in the next video, we will tackle another kind of complication, this time not because of the paint itself, but because of the color. Yes, for the simplification of the speech, I will say that black and white are actually colors. The difficulty in that case is to determine how to lighten and darken these two colors, which are by definition already the most extreme cases of luminosity. For the black scheme, because it is not possible to go darker than pure black, we will have to work with middle tones close to gray. And for the light, we will also need to go to bright gray to get a good contrast and create the non-metallic effect. And so now you probably guessed that the main challenge to create the illusion of a black reflective surface is to work with different shades of gray and to get to something that could look like this. In my opinion, there are two main points to take into consideration to succeed with this effect. The first one is obviously to choose the right color palette, but more importantly, to think smartly on how to spread those colors on the miniature. What should be the size of the reflections and how fast should be the transition from dark to bright within each reflection. The other critical point to me is to create contrasting elements on the miniature. I'm not talking about the usual contrast between shadows and light for a given color, but the contrast between different parts of the miniature that have different colors. If I take the example of Black Templars, having the very bright shoulder pads, almost white actually, really helps to make the rest of the armor look much darker than it is in reality. So we interpret more easily the shades of gray material as an actual, real reflective black surface. As usual, I will show you all the details of the paint job during the first 15 minutes of the video on the right leg, and then I will go more quickly over the rest of the miniature using the same techniques. If you like this kind of videos and if you want me to make more, please like this one, subscribe to the channel and share on your social networks. You can also join me on Patreon using the link just below. It will give you access to a private Discord where we can chat about miniature painting. And of course, you can also find my work in progress and other hobby projects on my Instagram page. Alright, so let's get to the tutorial, and as usual I will see you at the end for the last comments. Enjoy the video and see you just after. Okay, so we start by building the color scheme. I'll go first with the black undercoat, on which I will build up a simple gradient with two colors only, starting from the dark charcoal grey and going to a mix of charcoal and wolf grey to get a nice and bright grey tone with a little bit of blue in it. After the gradient is made, I will add depth to the dark tones by adding night blue. And then I will reinforce the shadows with the black glaze. Still with the glaze technique, I will finally push the highlights up to pure wolf grey to enhance the overall contrast. Now that the color scheme is in place, I will show you the painting process, starting with the right leg of the miniature. Before anything, I apply an undercoat using a black polyurethane paint. I'm using the airbrush, but it can obviously be done with a can or even with a brush if you have the courage. Then I can start to lock in the primary reflections, working with a mix of 50% charcoal and 50% wolf grey. As for the previous tutorials, I will go with the zenithal light configuration, which means the main source of light is placed above and far away from the miniature. Primary reflections will actually indicate where the light source is located, so in general I'm painting them on the top of each element that compose the leg. To link those elements together, I drew a line of light from the top to the bottom of the leg. It helps to create continuity between reflection points and to get the consistent lighting. About the shape of the reflections, I use a well-known simplification technique that consists of drawing circles on spherical shapes and rectangles on shapes that look like cylinders. Next, I will connect the highlights with the undercoat using a mix of 2/3 charcoal and 1/3 wolf grey, and I will work only around the zone I just painted before. At this moment, I only use the basic layering technique to establish the foundation of the gradient. The goal is to place the reflections quickly and properly, then we will come back with more advanced techniques to refine the transitions. After that, I will establish the lighter tones with a mix of 20% charcoal and 80% wolf grey. Same places as before, but this time reducing the surface to paint. Then with pure wolf grey, I will paint even smaller light points to further push the contrast. The idea is to gradually lighten the reflection, step by step with brighter and brighter tones, but still without worrying about the smoothness of the transitions. This is what I call the staircase gradation process. First, we lock in the light in a coarse but clean way to quickly visualize the global render, and then we take more time to smooth the transitions to obtain the final result. I then move to the secondary reflections, and I will use the exact same colors than before, with 3 levels of brightness. This time though, I won't push the highlights towards pure wolf grey, because secondary reflections are generally less intense than primary reflections, exactly because they come from a secondary light that already bounced onto the environment before getting to the character. One thing that helps me to place secondary reflection is to think that they actually represent the indirect light that comes from the surrounding environment, mostly from the ground. So I'm painting them on the inside part of the leg, oriented mostly towards the ground, and I still try to maintain the line of light to get consistent results. Since we are in the framework of a simplified non-metallic metal, I don't take into consideration possible variations of light, like for example the projected shadows of the miniature onto itself, or the presence of a light blocking or light reflecting element that could be somewhere near the character. I'll most probably present one way of doing more advanced and more complex NMM style in another series of tutorials later. And finally, I move to the tertiary reflections, again using the same colors and the same process as before. Tertiary reflections are coming from the light that bounce on the armor and reach another part of the armor, so they mostly come from the places where primary and secondary reflections were placed. With that in mind, I draw the tertiary reflections in the zones that are facing the bright spots I painted previously. Now that all reflections are in place and that the staircase gradations are done, I can move to the blending step to smooth the transitions. To create a smooth transition, I go for the fat glaze technique, which corresponds to a paint consistency between the glaze and the layer. The goal is to pull the paint from one zone to another to blur the transition. But because it's a semi-transparent consistency, we need to be careful with the direction in which we pull or push the paint. In general, there is much less pigment left at the beginning of the stroke and much more at the end of the movement when we take off the brush. So if my brush is loaded with the color number 2, for example, better to end the brush stroke in the zone number 2, not to leave any visible marks. The main idea is to pull the pigment by following small diagonals from zone number 1 to zone number 2, having paint number 2 on the brush. Then, with the brush loaded with paint number 1, I pull the pigment to zone number 1, but this time following the opposite diagonal to minimize the creation of visible strokes. I will repeat the same process 2 or 3 times until the transition line has almost disappeared. Finally, I will apply a standard glaze, so more diluted than for the fat glaze, over the entire transition. First with the color 1 towards zone number 1, and then with color 2 towards zone number 2. Contrary to the yellow and red paints we used in the previous videos, the grey tones I'm using now are quite opaque, so that makes the dilution a little bit more tricky to get to the right consistency. In that case, I need to generously thin down my color with water, But if I do too much, I will lose the interesting mechanical properties of the paint. It becomes less pleasant to apply and it's more difficult to hide the brush strokes. The acrylic component that we have in our paint brings the necessary viscosity to help dragging the paint over the surface of the miniature and to allow the pigments to rearrange themselves in a smooth and uniform way before the acrylic medium evaporates. If there is too much water in the mix, we lose this kind of lubricant property of the acrylic and so the pigment won't be able to spread uniformly. Though, one important thing, even if I don't usually thin down my paint too much, I use very little amount of paint at a time and my brush is always a little bit wet so I can easily pull the pigment on the miniature and get a nice and thin coat of paint. Next I will work on the lining. First I go with a mix of half charcoal, half wolf grey for all the edges. Then I add more wolf grey to the previous mix for the edges oriented towards the main source of light. And finally, with pure wolf grey, I push the brightness for the edges that receive the more light. In other paint styles, like the heavy metal style from Games Workshop, the lining is usually done with the same intensity for all the edges of the miniature. But for the non-metallic style, it's important to work with 3 or even more steps, with brighter and brighter tones when getting close to the most intense reflection points. It allows to confirm the placement of the light reflections and to enhance the illusion of very reflective metallic surface. Now that the lining is done, we can move to the color adjustment process. On one hand, to add subtle tint of blue in the shadows, but also to rebalance the different light spots and to give the overall scheme a darker look. Now let's simplify the miniature and consider just a sphere, where we can have our primary, secondary and tertiary reflections. The idea is to use the overlay technique to bring a bit of saturation to the gray scheme and adjust the light intensity. The overlay process consists of 4 steps. First, I do a partial coverage using a mix of 1/3 black and 2/3 night blue, using a very thin glaze consistency. At the moment, I will ignore the primary reflections and apply the paint only over the secondary, tertiary reflections and over the shadows. After that, I will go a second time with a mix of 2/3 black and 1/3 night blue, but this time over the entire miniature, including also the primary reflections. With step 3, I will reinforce the shadows with a filter of pure black. And for the last step, I will improve the highlights with pure wolf grey applied with the fat glaze consistency. The overlay technique is really not complicated, and it does not require outstanding skills and dexterity. However, it's important to know your paint and how much water you need to get to the desired consistency. I mostly use Vallejo paint, but it exists equivalent colors from almost all the other manufacturers, though the concentration of pigment and the way to thin it down might be different, so it's good to practice and gain experience with your own paints. In any case, I always advise to go slowly, progressively, and to work with very thin layers, better to do less than too much. And the beauty of this process is that we can repeat a step multiple times to adjust little by little the overall contrast. With that done, the right leg of the Space Marine is now fully finished. And then we can move quicker on the rest of the miniature. The technique is always the same. First, we establish a simple staircase gradation with the 2 initial colors, then we smooth the transition using the fat glaze technique. After that, we adjust the color scheme with the 4 steps overlay technique to give a blue tint to the shadows, retrieve the proper hierarchy of lights, and finally to improve the overall contrast. In the introduction, I talked about the importance of creating contrast between different parts of the miniature. Here we see very well why it's so important, because for the moment the leg I just finished still look grey, not really black. This is because the rest of the miniature is still with the black undercoat, so our eyes see those pure black elements and use it as a reference. So it basically reminds us that the other part of the miniature is still made of grey tones, not just black. But after all the paint job is done, and when I will add contrasting elements, in particular the white shoulder pads, the armor will look much darker, and it will look like black with reflection and not just grey. The black armor is now finished and we can move to the other metals and the other textures. I start with the dark NMM Steel using my usual recipe. For the base, I use heavy charcoal from the extra opaque range of Vallejo. Then I introduce a bit of electric blue to bring blue tones to the shadows. For the middle tones, I add more electric blue. For the highlights, I will incorporate more and more white to the previous mix until I get a sort of light bluish grey. Finally, I smooth all the transitions using the fat glaze technique. I went with the same recipe for the bolt rifle, making sure that the final render is brighter or at least of the same intensity as the black armor, but for sure not darker. For the other metallic parts, I will use the lighter version of my non-metallic silver recipe. I start with a lighter base made of heavy charcoal and electric blue. I then add a bit more electric blue again to create blue tints to the shadows. And then I progressively build up the gradient with white for the most intense lights. Now I move to the shoulder pads, this time using a new recipe that we could identify as Ivory White. I start with a base coat of khaki. Then I will build the reflection with bone white, but covering a large part of the piece. I will then increase the light intensity using more and more white to the mix, up to pure white for the brightest spots. The painting process is exactly the same as used for the black armor. First, I place the color in the style of a staircase gradation, and then I smooth the transitions with the fat glaze technique. It's not really a non-metallic white scheme. This will be the subject of the next video. Here, there is not enough contrast between light and shadows, and the light zones are quite large compared to what I would do for a non-metallic surface. So it's more like a matte surface look instead of a reflective metal. For the red trims, I'm using the same recipe I presented in the red NMM tutorial, using skin tones to light the base reds, and then using glazes of red and orange to bring more saturation. For the leather, I use light desaturated brown that I will simply lighten adding white to the mix. And finally, for the eyes, I will create a classic lens effect with red-orange tones and the famous little white dots to make it look like transparent glass. The miniature is now finished. It took me about 8 hours of painting, but as usual, it could probably be reduced to a few hours with a bit of practice and optimization. To summarize this process, I started with a simple gradient with only 2 colors, from dark gray to off-white, and all of that on top of a black base coat. After that, I applied a mix of blue and black with the consistency of a very thin glaze to bring a bit of saturation to the shadows and also to rebalance the lights. The process is very similar to what we did in the previous videos, and it's actually the goal of this series, to establish a workflow that is consistent but flexible enough to be adapted to any color scheme. In that case, one of the most important steps is the dark glazing, which allows adjusting the brightness and the shadows even after we are done with the blending process. If, for example, one area is too bright, if there is too much gray, or if I push too far with the light tones, I could then apply 1, 2 or even more coats of this dark filter to get to the right value, without going back to the time-consuming process of staircase gradation and then blending. And once again, I would like to highlight the importance of creating a strong color contrast or value contrast between the black armor and the other elements of the miniature. Because the NMM black is actually made of different shades of grey, it is essential to avoid that any other material on the miniature look darker than the armor itself. And it's also important to add very bright elements like the ivory shoulder pads in order to create sufficient contrast with the grey tones of the armor and to make it look like actual black. In the end, the effect works pretty well to me, and it is consistent with what we have done with the previous colors, both in terms of render and also painting process, as I explained just before. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. In the next episode, I'll be working on the non-metallic white effect, and this will be the last video of this series, at least the last long duration tutorial. But it's not excluded that I will make a few extra videos, much shorter, to look at some other colors, for example the Space Wolf scheme that many people already mentioned to me. Until then, I wish you the very best, have a nice day and see you next time.